In the autumn of 1912, Mrs. H and her family's Washington D.C. townhouse burned to the ground, leaving them desperate to find a fully furnished home as the cold weather set in and the housing market dried up for the season. Little did they know that the perfect old Victorian house they found would bring nightmarish hauntings that seemingly defied logic, with death knocking at their front door. The following story is from the perspective of Mrs. H, as documented by her doctor, who kept her real name hidden for privacy. It was a large, rambling, high-studded house built around 1870 and much out of repair. It had not been occupied by the owners for the past 10 years, though occasionally it had been rented for the winter. The house was situated on a sunny street, and although the sun bathed the outside of the house, it rarely seemed to penetrate through the tall and narrow windows. All the floors and the stairways were heavily carpeted. Absolute silence reigned through the house. Not a footfall could be heard. There was no electricity, the house being lighted throughout by gas. A Victorian house covered in carpet and no natural light? I can already feel myself dissociating. Anyways, where was I? Oh yeah, Mrs. H and her husband would move into the house on November 15th, and their children would join them 10 days later, once they got settled and made repairs to the furnace. Quote, my husband G and I had not been in the house more than a couple of days when we felt very depressed. I mean, your townhouse did just burn down, so I would probably be a little concerned if you weren't a little dysregulated at this point, and moving is just stressful alone. The house was overpoweringly quiet. The servants walked about on thickly carpeted floors so quietly that I could not even hear them at their work. Then one morning, she heard footsteps in the room above her. I hurried up the stairs. To my surprise, the room was empty. I passed into the next room, and then to all the rooms on the floor, and then to the floor above, to find that I was the only person in that part of the house. Okay, maybe it's a little bit more than just the effects of the lack of natural light and carpet in your house. On November 25th, the children arrived to their new home. We felt more cheerful after they arrived. The house seemed less big and solitary. But after a couple of weeks, Mrs. H started to feel unwell. I began to have severe headaches and began to feel weak and tired. I took iron pills 3 times a day and spent a couple of hours each afternoon in my room, lying down and resting. A rather discouraging process, and after resting, my headache was always worse than it was before. Every evening, her husband would go to the dining room to have some fruit before going to bed. In this house, when seated at night at the table with his back to the hall, he invariably felt as if someone was behind him, watching him. He therefore turned his chair to be able to watch what was going on in the hall. I mean, yeah, I don't like being perceived all the time. That's why you always choose the corner seat in these situations. And then the children started to feel the effects of whatever was going on. They grew pale and lost their appetites. The playroom at the top of the house they deserted, in spite of their rocking horse and toys being there. They begged to be allowed to play and have their lessons in their bedroom. Things slowly got worse as Mrs. H grew more tired and indifferent to everything, and also felt very cold in the evenings. The children seemed so poorly, and I was so tired. I took them away the day after Christmas for the holidays. To see a doctor, right? Right? Like, everyone in the house is getting sick or is fighting depression. Like, something's going on. Go see some sort of professional, right? Like, no? Okay, well, that's a choice, especially since the family had the financial privilege to go see a doctor. Her husband, who's known as G, and the staff would stay at the house. While we were away, G was frequently disturbed at night. There were multiple nights where he heard what he thought was a telephone bell. Several times, he was awakened by a doorbell ringing, but on going to the front and back doors, he could find no one at either. One night, he was awoken by hearing the fire department dashing down the street and coming to a stop nearby. He hurried to the window and found the street quiet and deserted. This ghost is really playing with his townhouse burning down trauma. Like, just let him process it on his own. Mrs. H and the kids would return to the house along with their nurse just after New Year's. We all felt better for a change and returned quite glad to settle down again. Soon, however, the gloom of the house began to cast a shadow over us once more. The children grew paler and had heavy colds. Mrs. H's symptoms also came back stronger. My headaches returned, and I frequently felt as if a string had been tied tightly around my left arm. Then, things quickly grew more disturbing. One night, I was awakened by a heavy door slamming once, quite near me. It woke G, too, and he said to me, "What was that?" "Only the door in the room," Mrs. H replied, but as she woke up, she realized that it couldn't have been any of the doors in the room as they were all shut. How could you calmly say that it was just a door slamming in the middle of the night? Like, no matter what it was, like, how could you go to sleep after that? Another time, a little before daylight, I was awakened by heavy footsteps going down the staircase behind the wall at the head of my bed. Then, a number of crashes downstairs, as if several pots and pans had been hit together or against the kitchen stove. She would become even more anxious as she realized that there was no staircase behind that wall, only the thickly carpeted front stairs on which no footsteps could be heard. She went on to say how because of the distance, it would be impossible in my room to hear any sounds from the kitchen, no matter how loud. Then, one late morning, Mrs. H recalled, I passed from the drawing room into the dining room. Coming towards me, a strange woman, dark-haired and dressed in black. As I walked steadily on into the dining room to meet her, she disappeared, and in her place, I saw a reflection of myself in the mirror, dressed in a light silk waist. I had laughed at myself and wondered how the lights and mirrors could have played me such a trick. She would see this person 3 other times, always with the same surprise to me and the same relief when the vision turned into myself. I feel like maybe, like all of us, she would benefit from doing some shadow work here. If you feel the same way, don't forget to like and subscribe. God, that was so cringy. Okay, anyways, let's keep going. The hauntings continued to get worse and more prevalent as the children began to see and hear things that challenged their reality. As I was dressing for breakfast one morning, B, who was 4 years old, came to my room and asked me why I had called him. I told him that I had not called him, that I had not been in his room. With big and startled eyes, he said, "Who was it then that called me? Who made that pounding noise?" I told him it was undoubtedly the wind rattling his window. "No," he said, "it was not that. It was somebody that called me." Who was it? B continued on insisting that someone had called him and for his mother to explain who did it. The days started to blur together as Mrs. H, her children, and her husband all grew paler and weaker. Some days, as their colds seemed worse, I kept them in bed. Then again, as there did not seem to be very much the matter with them, and they appeared to be growing too fond of staying in bed, I made them get up and go for a walk in the sun. It was very hard to make them eat. B would play vigorously for a little while, and then would lie, stretched out, limp and listless upon the floor, a toy in front of him clasped in his hand, his eyes glued upon it, and yet apparently neither seeing nor thinking about it. About half an hour late, perhaps, he would suddenly get up and play again. She said how there didn't seem to be very much the matter with them. I know mental health was like way more stigmatized back in the day, and like haunting spiritual things were definitely stigmatized back in the day. Either way, whatever your perspective is on this here, like her view would be stigmatized probably, right? So I guess I have to give a little grace for that there. But still, I feel like she should be a little bit more concerned. Mrs. H recalled how around this time, all of her houseplants that she had for about 4 years suddenly died. A ghost killing my houseplants, that would be my last straw. Or it's just a lack of natural sunlight going through the windows, right? Like, I don't know, definitely not a ghost. At the same time, everyone started to feel even more sick, more depressed, and even more out of control. Quote, "At the same time, I had a cold and cough, and ached all over as if I was going to get the flu. But I had no fever. I went on as usual." G wasn't doing quite well either, thinking that he was coming down with typhoid fever for the second time in his life. The staff was also suffering. They had become pale and drained of every ounce of energy. On the night of January 15th, we went to the opera house. That night, I had vague and strange dreams, which appeared to last for hours. When the morning came, I felt too tired and ill to get up. G told me that in the middle of the night, he woke up, feeling as if someone had grabbed him by the throat and was trying to strangle him. He sat up in bed and had a violent fit of coughing, which lasted about 5 minutes. His first thought that had been burglars were in the house, but as everything was quiet, he instantly dismissed that idea. It then flashed across his mind that I had been playing a joke on him. Upon looking at me, he saw that I was in a heavy sleep, very much as if I had been drugged. Mrs. H said how until they moved into this house, she had always been a light sleeper, but now nothing seemed to be able to disturb her. Quote, "Quite the contrary with G, for in the past he had always slept heavily, never hearing a sound, and nothing disturbed him. Now he was continually waking, answering the telephone and doorbell, which had never rung, and looking for burglars, who never materialized." The next morning after breakfast, Mrs. H asked for the children's nurse to come see her. Wait, this is the first time you asked to talk to your nurse about this? Like, this has been going on for how long now? And a lot has happened. It takes time to process things. But like, either everyone is experiencing a ghost, which, you know, don't have the best track record scientifically, or like everyone is like hallucinating and sick and all like at the same time. Things started to become even less explainable when she spoke to the nurse. She was a Scotch woman who had lived with me for several years. She looked worn and pale. And when I asked how the children had slept, she burst out with, "It had been the most terrible night. This house is haunted." I laughingly told her that this was the most ridiculous thing I had ever heard. "I would have said the same thing 3 months ago," she answered. "But I have had such experiences that I am now convinced of it. And everyone in the house has had experiences too." The nurse recalled how after being in the house for 2 or 3 days, that things had begun to happen. The staff had not wanted to tell Mrs. H, thinking that she ought not to be disturbed about it. But last night, when the children were attacked, it became my duty to let you know at once. While you were at the opera, about 8:30, B woke up and ran screaming through the hall to my room. "Don't let that man touch me!" He was terrified. It took Fraulein and me until 10 o'clock to calm him. He slept the rest of the night with me in my room. Fraulein slept in B's bed besides G Jr. to protect him. G Jr. did not wake up all night, but the muscles on his face kept twitching, as if someone was continually pinching him. In the morning, when he woke, he said indignantly to Fraulein, "Why have you been sitting on top of me?" And when she told him that she had not been sitting upon him, but had been in the bed next to him, he said, "No, you have been sitting on top of me." The nurse continued to tell Mrs. H how, often in the evening, after the children had gone to bed, never until after dark and the lights are lighted, Fraulein and I may be laughing and talking, when all of a sudden we hear the heavy tread of an old man walking slowly and steadily along the hall on the floor above us. It has not been one of the servants, for I have often run up the stairs to see, and I have found the whole upper story of the house in darkness and empty. Sometimes as I walk along the hall, I feel as if someone was following me, going to touch me. You cannot understand if you have not experienced it, but it is real. Some nights after I have been in bed for a while, I have felt as if the bedclothes were jerked off me. One night I woke up and saw sitting on the foot of the bed a man and a woman. The woman was young, dark, and slight. The man was older, smooth-shaven, and a little bald. I was paralyzed and couldn't move when suddenly I felt a tap on my shoulder and I was able to sit up, and the man and the woman faded away. I mean, not trying to claim this is what this is, but that does sound like textbook sleep paralysis. Like, you know, you can't move, you see things, and then all of a sudden you can move and they're gone. Like textbook sleep paralysis, right? I mean, like, not to discredit the creepiness and spookiness, that event sounds terrifying no matter what. But maybe this little bit of the story has a logical explanation right there. Maybe? The nurse would continue to share her experiences with Mrs. H, saying, "Sometimes, after I have gone to bed, the noises from the storeroom are tremendous. It does not happen every night. Perhaps a week or 10 days will pass, and then again it may be several nights in succession. Sometimes it sounds as if furniture was being piled against the door, as if china was being moved about, and occasionally, a long, fearful sigh or wail." Okay, I guess the sleep paralysis theory got a little bit weaker there. All I know is that regardless of what's happening, I definitely would not want to be in that house. After the nurse had shared everything, Fraulein, who is the children's private teacher, went to see Mrs. H. Damn, these people really had some money. Like, they had an entire staff of like nurses and cooks and teachers. And Mrs. H said how Fraulein also spoke of the heavy footsteps at night, like an old man in overshoes walking slowly along. She also heard the noises in the storeroom, the moving and piling up of furniture. She slept in a big 4-post bed with a canopy. One night, after she had been in bed for a little while, she felt the bed shaken and the canopy sway. Thinking that a draft from the open windows might be causing the sensation, she got up and closed them. She returned to the bed, and after a short time the shaking of the bed was repeated. Again, she got up, examined the room thoroughly, but was unable to unearth anything. Mrs. H then interviewed all of her staff, each one of them saying how they heard footsteps at night, going slowly across the corridor outside their rooms. Each one at first had thought it was one of the others, and was surprised, after inquiring, to find none of them about. They all spoke of the strange experiences after they had gone to bed, as if something crept around the bed and was over them, and then they were unable to move. Much amused as we were by all these tales, we nevertheless felt as if there was a serious aspect to it. I'm amused by these tales in hopes that they are just that and not something that defies our understanding of the world. How is everyone so nonchalant about this? I mean, like, I know they're starting to talk about it seriously now, but like, where's the sense of urgency? Like, for your health, your children's health, and your staff? Like, go watch an episode of The Bear to get that urgency in you. Like, if you believe in ghosts or not, there's obviously something going on here, and like, you should get some sort of help, right? Personally, I tend to view the world through a more logical framework, but I'm skeptically open, or like, we don't know that much, but we do know that the scientific method works pretty damn well. But maybe sometimes I'm skeptically open that maybe sometimes something could possibly fall outside of that, or at least our understanding of it. Yeah, maybe. Mrs. H would continue, why had all the servants whom we had for several years gone practically mad all of a sudden? Finally, she asked the damn question. Like, oh my god. This seemed to be the breaking point for Mrs. and Mr. H, and they started looking for answers. We began to trace back the history of the house. How the hell did they use Zillow back then? They're not a paid sponsor. The last occupants we found had exactly the same experiences as ourselves, with the exception that they stated that some of them had seen creeping around their beds, visions clad in purple and white. Going back still further, we learned that almost everyone had felt ill and had been under the doctor's care, although nothing ever definite had been found the matter with them. Saturday morning on the 18th of January, G's brother told them how he thought that they were being poisoned. So someone's poisoning the entire family and the entire staff, so wouldn't they be poisoning themselves? He went on to say how he had read an article which told how an entire family had been poisoned by water gas, a fuel that consists mainly of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. The brother then recommended that they immediately ask a professor, known as Professor S, to help them. Mrs. H said how, as he was out of town, his assistant, Mr. S, came at once to our house. We told him how ill and listless the children appeared. He found one of them lying on the floor, and the other two in bed. We related the experiences of the children and servants, and told him about the plants. He examined the house thoroughly from top to bottom and interviewed the servants. He then found the furnace in a very bad condition. The combustion began imperfect. The fumes, instead of going up the chimney, were pouring gases of carbon monoxide into our rooms. He advised us not to let the children sleep in the house another night. If they did, he said that we might find in the morning that one of them would never wake again. Early that afternoon, their physician arrived, and after examining the children, he agreed that they were being poisoned, and stated that none of us ought to stay in the house another night. They left the house immediately and stayed away while the furnace was being fixed. Once the furnace was free of leaking gas, they returned to the house. Everyone was able to breathe a sigh of relief, as their symptoms vanished and they settled back into their house, free of the toxic gas. The hauntings, the depression, and the physical symptoms all left. Mrs. H said how, that of all the family, B was the only one who seemed to have persistent symptoms following his exposure to the carbon monoxide fumes. Dr. Wilmer, who documented this story, would say in his report how B suffered damage to his vision, but it slowly improved over time after being away from the carbon monoxide. Now, I do realize that this might not be the traditional ending to a good spooky story where things continue to spiral out of control, or hauntings happen, people might even pass away, or are driven from their house. But death was at their front door. Who knows how much longer until one of the kids would have passed away from too much carbon monoxide, while everyone else's hallucinations and physical symptoms would have continued to get worse if they had not sought help. Not every spooky story has a clear-cut explanation, but maybe more often than not, they can be explained in a tangible and logical way, without negating the impact of the trauma of living through those experiences. And sometimes we can't explain them, and maybe we never will be able to. And that's okay too. At the very least, us humans really enjoy telling a good and captivating story. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, happy spooky season, and I'll see you again soon.